All right, it's 2 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Thank you to those who have joined Rodale and PCO today for this webinar. Some housekeeping: this webinar is being recorded and participants will receive a link once the webinar is posted. Additionally, if you wish to share this presentation with your neighbors or friends, the recorded version will be posted on our YouTube page. Questions and comments will be addressed at the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. And also, if you have any questions after the webinar, you can direct them to consulting@rodaleinstitute.org. Those emails will be on the last slide. Today's speakers will be Justine Cook, who is a certification specialist with Pennsylvania Certified Organic. PCO is a certification agency with almost 1,700 clients. They're located in central Pennsylvania in the heart of an organic hotspot called Spring Mills. My name is Emily Newman, and I'm an organic crop consultant with Rodale Institute. Rodale Institute is a 333-acre educational research firm located in Kutztown, PA, and has regional resource centers in California, Iowa, and Georgia. The Organic Crop Consulting Program is the newest program at Rodale Institute and fulfills Rodale's mission to assist farmers in successfully transitioning to certified organic production. The work is accomplished by providing technical assistance such as crop rotation planning and weed management guidance to farmers, landowners, businesses, and service providers in their efforts to transition farmland to certified organic and regenerative organic systems. We also translate 40 years worth of research to support the continuous improvement of soil health on our clients' operation. We also connect the agricultural communities by creating educational resources such as assisting with finding markets and networking with the organic community. This program is available nationwide and free for farmers in the Midwest and in Pennsylvania. Today's presentation will help farmers understand compliance and common issues with housing, feed, materials, and record keeping, how to address those issues, how to survive an audit, and at the end, we'll conduct a question and answer session. Justine will cover compliance now.
Thanks, Emily. We wanted to start the presentation by discussing a broad overview of the regulations and compliance so everyone understands what the process is rooted in and how it works and what it means. And that in turn would help you both understand how to avoid a noncompliance or respond or correct a noncompliance if you do encounter that. So when we're talking about noncompliance, we're talking about an instance when an operation does not meet the requirements of the Organic Foods Production Act of 1990 or the organic regulations. Part of the Organic Foods Production Act established the National Organic Program, which administers the regulation and provides oversight and enforcement. Under those regulations, accredited certifying agencies such as PCO certifiers determine whether operations that grow and process organic food are compliant with organic certification requirements. So if you go to the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, it's available online, you can see the list of requirements for getting certified and being compliant with the regulations. If you meet those requirements, then you're good. If certifiers notice a non-compliance or an area that you're not meeting the regulations, that's when you're issued what's called a notification of non-compliance. And that process of notification is also detailed in the regulations. Today, we're going to look specifically at compliance with livestock-related regulations. And these pop-ups are basically just to let you know that they're codified requirements that cover origin of livestock, feed, healthcare, living conditions. They're not for us to read right now, but we're going to look at how those affect compliance and what requirements you need to fulfill, and then conclude with a brief look at how all of these relate to record keeping. So if you do look at the regulations, you may be wondering how compliance is determined for some of those requirements. Not all of them include specific, quantifiable, or prescriptive directions. They may be open to interpretation. For example, what does sufficient mean? Well, that provides space for adaptability to a specific operation. It allows you to make production decisions based on your geographic area, the size of your operation, what product you're making or growing. And instead of requiring you to conform to a specific production model, you can adapt the regulations to your production model. Filling in the gaps where those interpretations are is where certifier policy comes in, as well as agreed upon best practices and NOP documents. And the goal of these resources and documents is the administration of a consistent standard in the marketplace while allowing for the diversity of operations. Certifier policy is the first one we're going to look at. That's developed internally. Generally, a certifier is saying, if you're following this policy, you're considered in compliance with this specific requirement. However, if you're not following the policy, it may not be a compliance issue. It depends on whether you're meeting the standard and can demonstrate that to your certifier. A step up in scope is the Accredited Certifiers Association Best Practices. The ACA is a membership group that's made up of a bunch of certifiers across the nation and even internationally, where they come together to agree on policies or best practices, again, for consistency's sake. So not only is there internal consistency, there's consistency among certifiers. And then an additional level up are NOP publications, such as policy memos, instructions, and guidance documents. They provide interpretive language for the regulations. However, with compliance, it all comes back to the Organic Foods Production Act and the USDA organic regulations. All of these things I'm mentioning, policy, best practices, publications, they need to be rooted in those regulations to be enforceable. So definitely read the regulations, but know that there are resources out there to help you understand their intent. So when is compliance determined? This flowchart is an overview of the certification process on an annual basis. Certifiers are required to review, inspect, and audit an operation's ability to comply with the regulations annually. So it all starts with the initial review or annual review of your organic system plan, which lays out the practices that you use on your farm. A certifier reviews the practices for compliance and your ability to comply. Depending on what they see, they may instruct an inspector to focus on a particular issue during your inspection. If it's determined that you're not able to comply with the regulations, there might be a compliance decision made, such as like a notice of denial or something similar to that. The second part is the inspection, where an inspector compares the on-farm practices to the submitted OSP for any changes and makes observations about the operation. It's important to note here that compliance decisions are not made at this stage. Inspectors identify potential issues of concern, but they're not communicating to you issues that must be corrected. They're reviewing your practices and gathering site-specific information and reporting back to the certifier. Finally, the last part is when the certifier reviews that inspection report that's been returned and determines, using, like we mentioned, the regulations first, then any internal policies or best practices, to determine the compliance of the operation. If a non-compliance is identified, that's when a compliance decision is made in the form of like a notice of non-compliance. And then when that's issued, it requires the operation to respond. I also wanted to include this third option for compliance decisions, which is if an operation reports a change in their OSP. Operations are required to notify their certifier of changes that may affect their compliance with the regulations. So for example, if you have a sick animal and the vet comes out and administers an emergency material, but that material hasn't been reviewed, depending on the circumstances, self-reporting could result in a compliance decision. So diving into the regulations, the first area we're going to look at is livestock housing, indoors and the outdoors. These requirements are primarily under the Livestock Healthcare Practice Standard and Livestock Living Conditions Standard. Under those standards, certifiers and inspectors are looking at whether animals can move comfortably, what kind of bedding's provided, the types of natural behaviors that are species specific, so can herd animals socialize, for example, and also how the space is cleaned. Some common compliance issues that we've seen include issues with manure. Manure is mentioned several places in the regulations, and the requirements for manure management are both for animal health and to reduce the risk of contaminating soil, water, and air resources. So you're required to prevent the contamination of natural resources. And then from an animal well-being perspective, waste need to be managed to prevent any issues with pests and diseases. In addition, operators are required to provide those conditions that accommodate natural maintenance and comfort, and bedding is a big part of that. Animals that root must have rooting material. Birds that scratch need material to scratch in, and animals have to have space to rest and materials to rest on. This last point here for poultry insufficient space, PCO has interpreted the livestock living conditions and healthcare standards into specific policy on space requirements for poultry, which we're going to look at the next slide. So these numbers are an internal policy that PCO has developed to determine whether there's sufficient space for freedom of movement, exercise, and reduction of stress. So again, with a policy, if you are providing this amount of space or more than this amount of space, indoors or outdoors, then we would consider you compliant with that requirement. If you're providing less space, then we would consider the plan not compliant without further justification. So these numbers are PCO specific. It varies by certifier. Some don't have specific space requirements, and they may just require you to submit justification for your housing density, or others may have different numbers. And since these are based on policy, again, they are subject to rebuttal by the operator. For example, if your numbers are different, but you're using a pasture-based system where you're moving the housing to fresh ground daily, you could discuss that with your certifier.
Manure is mentioned in several parts of the crops and livestock organic regulations. This is because manure is heavily relied on for nutrient cycle in organic and regenerative organic systems. It's important that the manure produced does not leach into streams, ponds, or cause harm to water quality. Additionally, manure can put the crops and soil at risk of contamination of heavy metals, regulations aside, it can also be unsightly, and neighbors may complain about improper manure storage. All facilities or properties that have animals that produce manure or apply manure to crop fields and pastures must have a written manure management plan. This includes livestock and poultry operations, small hobby farms, and horse owners. That are not defined as CAFOs, manure management plans can be prepared by farmer, although the farmer may benefit from getting assistance by those trained and experienced in developing manure management plans. Manure management plans do not have to be submitted for approval, but must be kept on farm and made available upon request. If you've been cited by your certification related to manure application, manure storage, or just general manure management practices, the first step would be to review your manure management plan internally and then with your certifier. This may need to be updated to come into compliance with the regulations. Specific adjustments that you could potentially make to your stored manure to make to any of your manure management practices to be useful and compliant. So you could increase the amount of pasture available so livestock can spend more time on pasture spreading their own manure. Additionally, you could spread manure more often so there's less need for storage area. If manure is produced in a small volume, you could store manure on your manure spreader so that it can be spread more frequently. Building a roof over your livestock living area can prevent rain from washing manure into waterways and contaminating waterways or pastures. And if your livestock are kept on bare lots, it's best to keep those bare lots away from water sources. It's important to remember that proper manure management can be used as an asset to your operation, who will use this manure as a nutrient source to produce better crops. If you're producing more manure than you can sustainably spread, you should consider reaching out to NRCS or another local agricultural permitting office for technical or financial assistance for building a manure storage area. Moving on to another topic of indoor living areas, Justine touched extensively on PCO's policy on living conditions. So if you are being cited as non-compliant for your poultry living areas, it's best to take a look at the animal welfare standards first. For example, the National Chicken Council recommends 6.5 pounds per square foot per animal for indoor space requirements, but the Global Animal Partnership, which is Whole Foods, requires 7.5 pounds per square foot. These resources can assist you in crafting justification for the number of animals in the space provided. In addition, discuss with your certifier how your experience as a professional farmer combined with the data from the certified humane creates a shelter that is temperature controlled, reduces potential for livestock injury, and allows for the opportunity to exercise. If you're not meeting the minimum requirements for indoor living conditions under your certifier's policy and under the animal welfare standards, it's likely that your animals may be exhibiting stress behaviors, and these living conditions may not be suitable for the organic regulations. Some things to consider would be to reduce the size of your flock. You could also increase your housing size. Also, adjusting the ventilation rate. High ammonia levels for birds and swine cause poor growth and performance. Basically, the rule of thumb is if you walk into your house and it's uncomfortable for you, it's going to also be uncomfortable for them. In addition to a shelter that allows for the opportunity to exercise, the regulations state that the producer of an organic livestock operation must also establish livestock living conditions year-round, which accommodate the health and natural behaviors of the animal. This is different depending on the species of animals, but most commonly swine and poultry operations into the straw. And for poultry, some natural behaviors include dust bathing. Rooting material and bedding contributes to these natural behaviors, so it's imperative to monitor living areas early on to recognize how often bedding needs to replace. Additionally, if your animals were to be confined due to disease or another reason, you may need to replace the bedding more regularly. So now that we've discussed indoor living conditions, let's move on to outdoor living conditions.
Yes, so access to outdoor space. What we're talking about is animals being able to freely exit their housing. And access to outdoor space is primarily covered under the livestock living conditions standards. The expectation under that standard is that animals have access to the outdoors year-round unless there are specific compliant reasons for temporary confinement, which are outlined under the standard and they are defined. So providing outdoor access is providing animals with the opportunity to exit the indoors. So we're looking at the number of exits that you provide, the size of those exits, can more than one animal exit the housing at one time, and making sure that there's no obstruction that discourages the animals from exiting the house. If outdoor access is restricted, certifiers are looking for the reason that animals were confined and the length of that confinement period. So some issues that we've seen, one is confining due to reasons not under the regulations. As I said, the compliant reasons for confining are defined and outlined. So for example, if you were to confine your animals because you aren't on the farm that day, but the condition outdoors is otherwise conducive for outdoor access, that would not be compliant. Or if you cite that the poultry pasture had standing water after a moderate rain, we'd be thinking, is this an issue where the standing water is potentially a source of pests or disease, or can you correct a drainage issue, which would then allow poultry to safely access that space? For ruminants, there are additional temporary confinement considerations in the regulations, but they're for specific events and specific time periods, so making sure you're aware of those. And finally, temporary confinement of poultry due to infectious disease like highly pathogenic avian influenza or infectious coryza. Those types of confinement events generally require additional scrutiny to make sure that you have sufficient justification that your animals are at risk from the disease if they are provided outdoor access, to make sure that you have a plan for accommodating all the natural behaviors indoors, and to make sure that you have a plan for monitoring when that confinement period can be lifted. Organic operations may see notices that there's a disease risk and all birds should be kept indoors, but just keep in mind that those notices are issued to all producers and generally are not considering organic certification requirements. So it's important to be in touch with your certifier before you make a decision that could affect your compliance.
To understand outdoor access versus confinement, let's take a deeper look at areas for confinement versus what's considered outdoor access. So outdoors is shade, shelter, exercise areas, fresh air, clean water for drinking, direct sunlight suitable for the species, stage of life, climate, and the environment. So that's directly from the regulations. So let's take a look at confinement. So here's a picture of a few dairy cows that are tied up. They are able to stand up and sit down, but they would not be able to freely move about and maybe turn around in 180 degrees. Here is another another confinement area for birds. This is a classic bird house. You can see that natural light is coming into the shelter. You can see that by the background of the picture. And the animals are able to move freely about indoors, but in this scenario, the exits from the shelter were closed and they were not able to access the outdoors at their own free will. So what's considered outdoors then? This is a shelter that was designed for some heifers. It's open on all four sides. They're able to get fresh water, clean drinking water, or fresh water, and there's ventilation, there's air moving through this. It's open on all four sides and they're able to freely move about. This is another similar shelter for some heifers, open on all four sides. The bedding is definitely suitable for the species. This is a little bit more of an old school version. It's just open on all four sides again, and animals are able to move freely about. This is obviously considered outdoors. This is just a poultry pasture. And here's another animal that is able to just freely move about out on the pasture. This is a very classic pasture-based poultry housing system, similar to what Justine had touched on earlier, that the housing structure will be moved, whether it's daily, maybe twice a day even, and it's open on all four sides and animals are able to move freely about within that. So one thing I want to point out is that regardless if your housing meets the requirement of the outdoors, you are still required to meet pasture requirements for ruminant livestock. So if we think back to those open on all four sides shelters, those animals are, yes, able to move freely about, but they are not able to graze on pasture. So they will still need to get access to pasture to meet the pasture rule. Now that we understand outdoors versus confinement, think about your own living conditions for your own livestock. Would the livestock area that you have be considered confinement, or would it be considered outdoors? If your living area would be considered confinement and the animals cannot freely move from the indoors to the outdoors, those animals are still required to get outdoor access every single day, especially during the non-grazing season for ruminants. Except for the reasons that are outlined in the regulations. So there are several, so take some time to read through this list. It is in the regulations, so you can read through the list directly in the regulations. It's important to understand what each of these mean and the implications they may have on your farm. So for example, inclement weather, which is that first bullet point, Inclement weather is defined in the regulations as weather that is violent or characterized by temperatures, high or lows, or characterized by excessive precipitation that can cause physical harm to the given species of livestock. Production yields or growth rates of livestock lower than the maximum achievable do not qualify as physical harm. So it's important to remember that even if it's 100 degrees during the day, it may only be 70 degrees after the sun sets, allowing for the animals to have access to the outdoors at a different time of the day. You could then put your animals on pasture overnight. This is not then considered confinement since they are given an outdoor access within a 24-hour period. Additionally, if you're confining because of risk to soil or water quality because your pastures are flooded, this may be allowed for a short period of time if there was a rain event that was large and abnormal and dumped a lot of water onto your pasture. But if your outdoor yard or sacrifice lot is flooded day after day, month after month, it may be time to implement changes that increase the usability of your outdoor access areas, such as implementing drainage tools or building concrete paddocks. The other important part of this is making sure that the confinement is within the time frame described in the OSP. For example, newborns can be defined, so this is in regards to the ruminant livestock. So newborns can be defined up until 6 months, but after that, they are required to have outdoor access. Where livestock farmers occasionally find themselves in trouble here is if fall calves are born and spring calves are then born the next year, the farmer will wait until May and put the young heifers out together. For those fall calves, they may be about 7 or 8 months old now at this point, which is not compliant with the regulations. So if your reason is compliant to the regulations, but you still received a non-compliance, it's very important that you update your organic system plan. So call your certifier upon receiving any condition or non-compliance to update the different sections of your organic system plan and describe every scenario in which you may confine within the regulations. So these are some snapshots of PCO's organic system plan, tables 6.8 through 6.14. They give the reason for confinement if there is any time frame that is related to that confinement, and then allow the operator to describe any circumstances in which they would confine. So use this heavily and think about any scenario in which you would potentially confine in your operations. If your reasons are not compliant, it's time to update your practices. Some common non-compliant practices are confining for 24 hours, 1 day a week, such as maybe you have a full day poker tournament on Mondays with all of your farming neighbors. This would be considered confining, and they would need to receive outdoor access during that day period. Another practice is confining livestock groups to preserve pastures for milkers. These are not compliant and should be addressed by updating your housing structure, potentially expanding your pastures or expanding your sacrifice area, your sacrifice lots. Additionally, confinement must be documented. So if you are confining for any reason, you must keep a log to document when you confine. And this is for the whole herd, or this might just be for one cow. In addition to confinement per the regulations, certifier policy may allow for confining for disease outbreaks as highly pathogenic avian influenza, as Justine had mentioned. It is vital that as soon as an outbreak occurs, that you are putting your animal and the animals are being put at risk, you contact your certifier to enact a plan that is compliant. It's important that you track disease outbreaks by following your local newspapers or online resources such as APHIS. The Penn Ag Poultry Council has a great website, as well as the PA Animal Diagnostic Lab Systems. Additionally, to prevent the spread of disease, it's important to monitor the birds for signs of sickness and discourage visitors, and also enacting biosecurity practices such as making all visitors wear plastic booties or washing the shoes prior to entering the house. Also, tell your certifier about these biosecurity practices. They will update your organic system plan to include this information so that inspectors who do come onto your operation comply with all the biosecurity practices that you have outlined.
The third area we're looking at today is medical treatments and health. These requirements are primarily covered under the Livestock Healthcare Practice Standard, but are also mentioned under livestock feed and livestock living conditions standards. So for physical alterations, certifiers are looking at why the procedure is performed, the age at which it's performed, the method, and depending on those details, whether you've consulted a vet. It's also an important part of the regulations that practices and products are traceable in your system. And we should note that there are different origin requirements for different products. So here I have listed slaughter stock must be managed organically since the last third of gestation. Dairy products, meat products, poultry products, and fiber products all have requirements for the start of organic management in order to sell the product as organic. So, some issues that we've seen. Physical alterations are allowed in the regulations. However, pretty often certifiers have specific policies around the procedures that can be performed. And there may be documentation requirements, or like I said, there might be a requirement for a vet consultation depending on the age of the animal or the procedure you're using. It's important to outline what you plan to do in your organic system plan so your certifier can let you know if they have a policy, or to contact your certifier if you have questions about their policy. And for number 2, while operators frequently do know their animals well, the regulations require third-party verification. So for example, an inspector needs to be able to ID an animal in your pasture and then look through your herd book and trace her back in your records using that ID. And then for the third one here, again, looking at dairy specifically, you can transition a dairy herd to organic production. And at the end of the transition period, when they're certified, their milk can be sold as certified organic. But to sell a cull member of the herd as organic slaughter stock, they must have been under organic management since that last third of gestation. And then tying back to traceability, the inspector must be able to verify that the animal is eligible for slaughter stock. So it's important to be familiar with the origin of livestock requirements for all of your animals.
Similar to indoor space allowances, the USDA does not define specific parameters for physical alterations, although certifiers have coordinated policy together for more clearly defined allowances. For example, an ACA best practice document indicates that debeaking is not allowed, but beak trimming is allowed 10 days or before of life for poultry. In a similar manner, this is an excellent opportunity for you to consult the animal welfare guidelines for physical alterations, such as beak trimming. These resources can assist you in crafting justification for any physical alteration you would like to have done on your operation. So it's important to also discuss with your certifier, again, your professional experience as a farmer combined with the data of the animal welfare organizations, how it meets the requirements to promote animals' welfare and minimize stress and pain. So always be sure to talk to your vet and update your OSP to include standard practices on farm. It's also important to know what is not allowed as far as physical alterations. The ACA best practices document has very clearly stated what is not allowed as physical alterations. This includes debeaking, desnooding, and also needle tooth clipping of more than the top 1/3 of a pig, and also tail docking in pigs. So always be sure to understand what isn't allowed to better understand what is allowed. So diving into an example a little bit further, let's take dehorning, since that is a very common practice in livestock operations. Some standards state that cautery paste is allowed, but it's important to understand that any dehorning paste is prohibited in organic production. If your method is to use banding, but you let the heifers get to over the age of 6 months, a surgical procedure should be used. At that point, it's vital to consult with a vet and your certifier to ensure the methods and practices are compliant. The vet may say you're capable of doing the procedure by yourself, in which you would need written documentation for your certifier to even consider allowing this. All physical alterations are considered on a case-by-case basis by the certifier. Although not directly related to the health of the animal, identification is an extremely important part of the audit control system of the health of your animal. Because you know your animal so well, you as a farmer often have less concern whether Daisy has an ear tag in her ear, because you know who Daisy is and your wife knows who Daisy is, and so do your children. Unfortunately, though, your inspector or certifier does not know who Daisy is. It's important that if an inspector observes your herd, they're able to identify each animal in the case of sheep, goats, and cows, and other large livestock. So let's take a look at some options. Here is animals that are ear tagged. They're tagged in one ear. One suggestion I would make is that when you're tagging, to double tag, do tags in both ears in case one falls out, which happens fairly often. Another option is neck chains. The neck chains can help third parties identify that animal fairly easy. And then the last, if you have a small closed herd, sometimes farmers use identification cards. This identification card has a picture of the livestock. It also has a unique identifier or a description, the date of birth and the name. If you don't use names and you use numbers, the numbers would need to be on here as well. Unique identifiers can be things such as the only all brown cow on the farm, or maybe Daisy has a white triangle on her forehead and no other animal in the herd has a white triangle on her forehead. In the case of swine and poultry, it's important that the group of animals is identifiable when they go to slaughter. For example, Flock 2 2019 indicates that this was the second flock of 2019. This does not negate you from keeping medical records. So for example, using swine as an example here, if you have a few pigs that were given medical treatments, this should be tracked on a per pig basis. It's less likely though that if an inspector sees that pig number 4121 was given a medical treatment, that they will ask you to climb into the pen of the 200 pigs, each weighing 200 pounds, and ask you to find specific pig 4121, unless that is that the specific medical treatment makes them ineligible for slaughter, which we'll talk more about next. So speaking of ineligibility for slaughter, it's important to remember that dairy animals are treated differently than animals that go on to be sold as certified organic slaughter stock or certified organic meat. If a livestock product is sold, labeled, or represented as organic, that animal must be under continuous management from the last third of gestation. This means that your original transition animals in your dairy herd cannot be sold as organic slaughter stock. If your transition occurred on 4/1/2017 and you became certified organic on 4/1/2018 for dairy cows and dairy milk, but Daisy was born on February 5th of 2015, she would not have been under continuous organic management. She would have previously been part of a conventional milking herd. Additionally, some materials have meat withdrawal periods. Be sure to check if any medical treatments that you are giving your animals have a meat withdrawal period. Xylazine and lidocaine, they both have an 8-day withdrawal. So if an animal was treated, they could not be sold immediately after for slaughter. Synthetic parasiticides, which are moxidectin and fenbenzol, are strictly prohibited in any slaughter stock. And this is a reminder to any of the dairy producers in the crowd that ivermectin is no longer allowed for both dairy cattle and beef cattle, that started in December of 2019. The inspector will audit any animal sold as organic slaughter stock. They'll want to know the name and ID, the birth records, healthcare records, and the sales receipt that links the livestock ID to the sale of the organic animal. One thing to keep in mind is that the receipt often contains an ID number. But this ID number is given by the buyer so that the buyer can track it. And the buyer's ID does not link to your animal ID. So it's important to write your own ID or your own identification code onto the invoice to better track the sale of the livestock.
Our fourth subject is feed, forage, and pasture. NOP requirements for pasture access and grazing management are very important to be well versed in if you're raising organic ruminants. There's a specific definition for the grazing season, and there are specific requirements for documenting what your ruminants are eating, both during and outside of that grazing season. And this is partially to make sure that they're compliant with the pasture requirements, that they're getting 30% dry matter intake from pasture averaged over the grazing season as a minimum, but it's also to allow for feed audits. So some common issues that we've seen in the area of feed, forage, and pasture include operators supplementing their ration with hay. Maybe they observe that their animals need a little bit more hay, but then they're not tracking the actual pounds of hay fed. And again, that's important for audits, and it's important for being able to calculate the amount of dry matter intake for grazing. Or they have a planned ration, but maybe they deviate due to feed availability or feed quality. However, again, they're not documenting that change in their records, which affects the audits, and it affects being able to calculate dry matter intake from grazing. And some operators have said that they thought that dry matter intake from grazing requirement only applies to milking cows. However, the pasture rule does apply to all ruminants over 6 months of age. Another issue is if operators don't have a clear method for tracking or calculating DMI, or dry matter intake. If there are weather extremes like flooding or droughts during the grazing season, which are becoming more frequent, you want to be tracking where you're at with the average dry matter intake throughout the season. And that way, if you're finding that you're falling short and you know that you're going to have a late summer interruption of grazing, you can make some management decisions in the fall, like sowing a summer annual for grazing or grazing hay fields. And just to note, in that general area, because it is becoming more of an issue with droughts and flooding, it's outside of the scope of this webinar, but if you're in an area that received a disaster declaration due to weather and you are tracking DMI and seeing that you're having an issue meeting requirements, definitely be in contact with your certifier to discuss temporary variances and the types of kind of regulatory methods of addressing that issue.
Before diving into the basics of calculating the dry matter intake from your livestock, consider a couple of the following. How often do you feed your animals? Are you feeding them once per day or twice per day? How do you feed the groups of animals? Sometimes farmers will feed them all together. Sometimes farmers will separate the dry cows from the young heifers, from the older heifers, from the dairy cows. And it's important, as far as record keeping goes, to track daily. You'll quickly forget what you fed extra last Thursday due to the pasture availability being low. So track now, consolidate later. It's also important to be adaptable. Your record keeping system won't be perfect the first year, and it probably also won't be perfect on year 10. Continuous improvement is the name of the game. So templates exist, utilize them, or you can also make your own. Justine and I had a really hard time determining what information to touch on this topic. It's a big topic, and failing to comply could result in a serious noncompliance. Today, we will only cover a very small percent of dry matter intake information. If you feel like you need more on this topic, let us know in the Q&A area or send us a message. This topic probably deserves a whole hour on its own. So there are many resources that exist, but this is going to showcase an example, some snapshots from PCO's guidance document. So step one is to understand what each animal group dry matter demand is. Step two is understanding the dry matter content of the feed. Step three is to track the feed as fed per animal group and the number of days on pasture. And step 4 is to track dry matter intake from pasture by subtracting feed is fed per animal group. This will give you your percent of DMI from pasture. So what this actually looks like is, so this is a screenshot that is showcasing dry matter demand and percent body weight value for both dairy cows and beef cows. As you'll notice, this particular document splits it into different breeds. So for smaller breeds and larger breeds, and then the amount of milk production per day, what that could indicate for their dry matter demand needs. So utilizing these charts is really important to understand what it is that your animals are demanding. The next is understanding the dry matter content values of the common feed sources. So if you're a grass-based operation, you're obviously going to want to know what the dry matter demand of hay and haylage and baleage would be. If you're feeding grain, most likely that dry grain, whether it's corn or beans or other small grains, is going to be right around 80% dry matter, 89% dry matter. The next thing that's important is tracking the number of days that your animals are on pasture. This is just a screenshot from ATRA's document on livestock record keeping, but I've seen this done in so many different manners. There was actually a farmer who created a wall-sized calendar, and every day that the animals were on pasture, the children would come in and they would color that specific number. So they created a game out of it as the better way to keep records. So this is a screenshot from the feed as fed tracking. As you'll notice, there's many important parts to this. Specifically, this is for dairy cows. This is the class of animal is mid-lactation, and this was the feed ration that they were feeding for 145 days. So these animals were on pasture, but they were also receiving daily 10 pounds of a grain and mineral mix, as well as 6 pounds of dry hay. And that's how they got their dry matter intake as fed. So the next thing is determining with the total DMI that is being received from pasture, and how this is determined is taking that dry matter demand number that we determined in the very beginning and subtracting it from the total DMI from non-pasture. So this 14 is the sum of 8.9 plus 5.1, which was the dry matter fed. That means that 21 pounds of dry matter intake was coming from pasture. And then to get that dry matter intake from pasture percentage, you're simply taking the total dry matter intake from pasture divided by the dry matter demand to get a ratio. That ratio is multiplied by 100 to get a percentage. So in this scenario, these mid-lactation cows were receiving 60% dry matter for actually the entire period of the grazing season. There's many different ways to track this, not just utilizing PCO's spreadsheets. You can do it in a journal, you can do it on a calendar. Maybe if you're very technologically savvy, you will track in an Excel spreadsheet that you've built on your own, or utilizing your cell phone to capture these records as well. So we understand that this was just a brief overview, and so if you still need help with tracking dry matter intake from pasture, you can also utilize a nutritionist. You can find resources from the National Organic Program. They created a whole group of resources that are called the National Organic Program's Dry Matter Intake Information for Access to Pasture, and you can find that in the program handbook. They've got 7 different documents to help you better track your dry matter intake. Additionally, a local extension agency could help. You can always call Rodale Institute, and we're happy to help you through these record-keeping processes. And your certifier, although they cannot consult, is willing to talk to you about better ways for tracking dry matter intake that are compliant with the regulations. So it's important to remember that record keeping should be a continuous improvement.
So materials use is a big subject that can be tricky for operations new to certification. What's allowed and what's prohibited is covered in quite a few areas of the regulations, including the actual list of allowed synthetic substances and prohibited non-synthetic substances, plus regulations on healthcare, feed, and generally what's permissible in organic production. You're required to provide your certifier with a list of materials, including their manufacturer and how they'll be used on your operation. Bedding may be considered a material if it's newspaper or wood-based. If it's roughage like corn, fodder, or straw, it needs to be certified. So if it's wood-based, we're looking at whether you have information on the source of wood products showing that they don't have prohibited additives. Feed supplements and vitamins may require vet prescription depending on how they're used, and your certifier will let you know of any restrictions for materials. The bottom line is that there's a specific list of allowed materials and prohibited materials, and there are restrictions for how those materials can be used. So there's the point that the material needs to have compliant ingredients, needs to be processed in a compliant way, and then the point that it needs to be used in a compliant manner. Some issues that we've seen are relying on other than approved sources for information on whether a material is compliant, such as like a sales representative or sometimes even a vet. Material statuses can change over time, so you may be getting outdated information. Not providing enough information for your certifier to determine compliance. This can hold up a new applicant's request for certification because we need to verify that all materials used are compliant and are used compliantly. Or using a material before you've checked whether it's allowed. And the take home here is that it's really vital to make your certifier your source of information on materials compliance. PCO has a materials review program, so we review materials at our client's request at no extra cost. It's part of choosing PCO as your certifier. We also approve specific other material review organizations, but outside of those sources of information, you're risking a non-compliance.
Although not considered a material, certified organic agricultural products are used in operations very often, such as complete feed mixes that you don't produce on site, or as Justine had mentioned, forage for bedding. Be sure to keep organic certificates and invoices for the product on site. You may also wish to utilize the Organic Integrity Database to confirm the certified organic status of an operation. Always be sure that the certificate and or the addendum indicates what products are specifically certified organic. So in the case of a forage for bedding, if you're using organic straw, that the invoice should very specifically say organic straw, and that the invoice has a date, what product was sold, its organic status, and the supplier's name and address matches what's on the certificate. So if you have an invoice from John Smith's farm, but the certificate says Smith's Organic Farm, the certifier and the inspector is not able to match that invoice to the certificate. So this is a fairly easy one when it comes to materials. There are several sources you can use to confirm compliance of a product, and when in doubt, call your certifier. Your certifier may have their own internal material review service, similar to PCO's, or they may utilize other services such as the WSDA or the Organic Materials Review Institute. In general, any products that are reviewed by OMRI and have the OMRI seal are allowed for use. So after you've confirmed that the product is allowed, you must also confirm that you're utilizing them within the restrictions that are outlined. So for example, this first is a picture of a snapshot of PCO's materials review book. So for HeatSeek by Cowmaster LLC, it contains the restriction medical treatment, which means that it must not be used in the absence of illness, and you must also have records documenting the animal that was treated, the treatment duration, and why the animal was treated. Below is a snapshot from Omri's website. In this particular dolomite is allowed for livestock, as we can see by the LF, which stands for livestock feed. But it also has a restriction that says it must not be fed in the amount above those needed for adequate nutrition and health maintenance for the at its specific stage in life, for the species at its specific stage of life. It's also important to note the American flag here. Omri provides review services for the core standards, which are the Canadian standards. So it's important to look and make sure that the product is actually reviewed to the USDA NOP standards. Vet treatments is an area where farmers can often get in trouble as well. It's important to take any vet recommendations with precaution. Your vet will prescribe you treatments, but those treatments may not be allowed in organic production. So always contact your certifier first prior to having a vet administer any treatments. In addition, if a vet does administer a treatment, such as in this example here, where Dr. Smith gave Daisy fenbenzol on September 22nd of 2019, always be sure to document the who, what, when, and why. Always document how much, and in best case scenario is actually keeping the bottle to show the inspector. So always be sure to document who received the treatment, which was Daisy or cow number 319, and what the product was. This was a fenbenzol by Merrick, and she was given a 3,000 milligram dosage, and the date that was treated and why. In this case, Daisy had parasites. So if you're using a product prior to the review of approval from your certifier, there are 3 scenarios that could happen. A, the product is allowed. B, the product is allowed, but it contains restrictions. And C, the product is prohibited. The scenario where you might be using a product prior to approval or review that may occur is materials that are generic, like an Epsom salt or a barn lime. You know that it's likely allowed, but you don't want to go to all the trouble to call your certifier. Maybe you don't have time to look it up, so you just chance it to see what happens. If the product is allowed, you may still receive a noncompliance for utilizing a product without contacting your certifier first. 205-400 states that a person seeking to receive or maintain organic certification under the regulations in this part must immediately notify the certifying agency of any changes that have occurred in the certified organic operation that may affect compliance. So this means that if it's allowed, you are still risking at putting your operation into non-compliance territory. If it's allowed, but it contains restrictions, you could also receive a non-compliance because you're not utilizing the product within its restrictions. Therefore, you could receive a non-compliance for 205-400, but you could also receive a non-compliance within the national list 205-602, 603 that indicates you're not using the material correctly. And if the product is prohibited, you're risking a lot more than that. Severity of the consequence depends on the type of material and how it was used. You could potentially be risking giving an animal treatment that actually may disclude them from the herd.
So we left record keeping for last, and it really is a big topic and generally where we see growing pains for new operations in terms of both adjusting to the requirements and finding a system that works for them. Even when an operation is compliant with the production and handling requirements, if they're not documenting their practices according to their OSP with sufficient detail or retaining those records for at least 5 years, they're not compliant with NOP requirements. So the regulations or requirements here are just highlights from the record keeping by certified operations standard. And you can see they're pretty broad and far reaching. The point is that the system can be adapted to your needs and your preferences, but it needs to meet the standard. So some issues that we see Pretty commonly leaving some practices out of your record keeping system, thinking that they may not be important, or keeping records in a way that doesn't provide enough detail for auditing, which we'll look at briefly next. Or you keep records, but you're either not organizing them, so at inspection you can't find the information, or you put away records from the previous year and don't have them available for inspection. All of those would be considered not compliant. So just briefly, when we say provide enough detail for auditing, what is an audit? Inspectors perform 2 audits during inspection to verify 1, that your practices are compliant, and 2, that your record keeping system is compliant. So a mass balance audit, commonly known as an in-out audit, is used to demonstrate that the organic inputs purchased or produced, which is the in part, were sufficient in quantity to produce the organic products that were sold, which is the out part. So do your records show that you purchase or produce enough feed to balance with the feed fed in your ration records? Does the inventory of feed also balance with your records? And then the traceback audit is used to demonstrate that an organic product can be traced back to its origin in the operation. So the inspector selects a product, which could be an animal, or it could be a product like feed, and attempts to follow its trail of production by linking elements on the operations records and documents. So herd health records, lot number, invoice numbers, and Emily has more on this subject.
So we're just going to take a look at 2 different examples of mass balance audits and 2 different examples of tracebacks. And these are very common mass balance and traceback audits that occur at livestock operations. So if you're certified organic, it's likely that you've been through a very similar audit. So for the first one, you have milk picked up every 2 days. The milk pickup rotates between an AM pickup and a PM pickup. For each milk pickup, this usually includes about 5 milkings or 2.5 days worth of milk. You currently have a herd of 35 head of milkers. The inspector looks at your milk pickup slip and it states that there's 10,000 pounds of that were shipped on April 1st of 2020. Your grass-fed herd averages 30 pounds of milk per day. Is the amount of milk that the truck picked up reasonable for the number of cows that you have? So if you have 35 cows and they're each producing about 30 pounds per day, and that specific shipment included 2.5 days or 2.5 days, you're producing about 26,000 pounds of milk. So this is not a sufficient mass balance audit. Your milk pickup slip said 10,000 and you really should only be producing about 26. So what was the last 74,000 pounds? And in some cases, this could be a way to discover fraudulent activity. Other times, slip-ups like this may have very simple answers, such as you had been storing milk because there was a big snowstorm and the company was unable to come and pick up the milk, or potentially your neighbor's milk storage system was leaking, so you had to store organic milk from a neighbor. In all of these cases, you should call your certifier or make sure you're keeping really good documentation of all these things that are occurring that may impact your audit. So let's take another example. You feed your dairy cows 1.5 pounds of corn every day just as a supplemental protein. In 2019, you had 43 dairy cows. Receipts from your neighbors indicated that you purchased about 4.3 tons of corn grain on October 3rd, an additional 2.3 tons of corn from another neighbor on March 4th of 2019. At that time of inspection, which occurred on May 1st of 2019, you stated that you ran out of corn inventory yesterday, and this time period was about 211 days. And on that October 3rd, where you got your original shipment, you had a 0 inventory. So was this amount of grain that you purchased reasonable for your herd size? So if you had 43 cows per day and you were feeding them about a pound and a half of corn for 211 days, that means that you would need about 13.6 thousand pounds of feed required. You purchased about 13,200. This is a very, very low deviance, and could really be indicated by anything, 400 pounds being off over the course of 211 days is not that much. So this would be a sufficient audit. So let's take a look at two different tracebacks. Eggs are picked up from your farm every 3 days in the morning. The invoice from the egg company indicates that on May 1st, 2019, 102 dozen eggs with lot numbers HLB 19118, HLB 19119, etc., were picked up. Your organic system plan states that your lot coding system is the bird variety, so Highland Brown, the year, and the Julienne date. Your OSP also states that you currently have approximately 400 birds and a really high lay rate of 98%. The inspector traces HLB 118 that links to the production records for April 28th. These production records indicate that you packed 33 dozen of eggs on that date. So could we successfully link the eggs that were sold with the lot number of HLB 19118 all the way back to the production records? And the answer is yes. So this was a successful audit. Let's take one more. You sold a live dairy cow, which was Daisy number 16, to your local organic butcher shop. He paid you an organic premium for the cow because he intends to sell it to a local family at a price premium as certified organic. The inspector asked to see the birth records for Daisy and the health records. Your records indicate that Daisy was born on 4/1/2016 from the dam that's name was Doozy. Health records indicate that Daisy had parasite issues in 2017 that caused the vet to give her fenbenzol. So was this a sufficient audit? So this is a tricky one because we were very able to successfully trace Daisy back to her dam, and we were able to look at the health records. But unfortunately, this may result in a non-compliance because Daisy was not eligible for organic slaughter stock. Record keeping and audit control systems are very unique to every farm. No two farms are going to have the same system. So these are the instructions from the NOP, and think about how they apply to your operation. So developing a record keeping system takes time. You can always give Rodale a call and we can walk you through different options to get your record keeping system in tip-top shape for your next audit. The conclusion to this is do not avoid any letters from your certifier. As soon as you receive a condition or noncompliance, call your certifier. Your certifiers are required to explain the regulations even though they cannot consult. Advocate for yourself. You are a professional with years of farming experience, and your certifier interprets the legal standards. So we now have some time for questions. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We only have a few minutes for questions, so I am going to read one or two off here. This first one, Justine, may be for you. So it says, I am a small poultry farmer and I want to expand my organic flock. Can I buy layers from a neighboring operation to add them to the current flock?
Yeah, that's a good question. So back to when we were discussing origin of livestock requirements, poultry have a specific origin of livestock requirement that is organic management must start no later than the second day of life to sell those products like eggs or the actual bird, the eggs from the layers as organic. So your neighbor would be required to be certified organic in order for you to compliantly use any of their layers. And you would need to keep the appropriate records, the certificate, the invoice tying the layers to the certified operation.
Great, thanks, Justine. The second question here is about the organic integrity database. So just a question about what is the organic integrity database. This was previously mentioned in an earlier slide regarding verifying that a certified organic product was in fact certified organic. The Organic Integrity Database was developed by the USDA National Organic Program, and it is a database that includes the name and address and certified products of every certified organic farm and or processor in not just the United States, all around the world, but anybody who's certified to the National Organic Program. So a farmer can utilize the Organic Integrity Database to verify if a product is certified organic, or if a neighbor is certified organic by just searching their name or the address. And also you can figure out who they're certified by, whether that's PCO or another agency. Okay, that's what it looks like. We've only got time for those couple questions. I want to thank everybody again for participating and coming to this webinar. Again, this is recorded, so you'll be sent the link, and this will also be posted on the Rodale Institute YouTube page. If you have any questions, you can email the consulting team at consulting@rodaleinstitute.org. Or if you're ready to get certified and you want to get certified by PCO, you can email them at pco@paorganic.org or give them a call at 814-422-0251. Thanks, everybody.